If you're like me and have a crippling addiction to MMOs that's festered over many years and impacted your life, and you've never been able to kick the habit, then you're probably wondering if New World is worth your time and your hard-earned dollars. With the game's slated release within the month, I thought it would be good to review the game in its current state and compare that with my previous experience playing the first New World preview test last year, which I put more than 50 hours into, to see if we can glean what its future may look like. New World is a massively multiplayer online game developed and published by Amazon Games. More specifically, the game is being developed by Amazon Games Orange County, a subdivision of Amazon Games formerly known as Double Helix Games. They were responsible for such games you might know as Silent Hill Homecoming, Front Mission Evolved, and Strider. And don't worry if you've never heard of them before, because neither have I. So, what does a multi-billion-dollar company do when trying to crash into the MMO market? They make a PvP-centric, open-world exploration, action combat MMO with faction-controlled territories. This has proven notoriously difficult for many developers in the past. It's that one mythical balance that no one has really successfully pulled off to date. It's extremely ambitious, but I will acknowledge that Amazon, if anyone, has the budget to pull it off. So let's talk about gameplay. On first loading into the game, you head to server selection. The UI is simple and fairly intuitive. Once you enter, a nice little cutscene plays introducing the player to the captain of the ship, taking your character to the world of Aeternum. For some reason, Father Russo sounds like Optimus Prime. There's nothing wrong with it, I just thought it was an odd choice for a character who's recounting his near-death experience to sound so ominous and narrator-like. Anyway, fast forward to character creation. I don't personally care too much for in-depth character creation, but I know that many people do. Here though, I feel like New World drops the ball. The character creation is simple and uninspired, and leaves very little room for the player to customize their character in meaningful ways. Maybe I'm spoilt by other MMOs that I've played before, but it's almost the gold standard these days for character creation to have sliders. You can customize a sandwich at Subway more than you can customize your character in New World. After creating my character, it's off to waiting in the login queue even though the population of this server is rated as low. Bizarre. You load into the starting area and the game quickly enters you into a tutorial sequence that lasts about 5 to 10 minutes. A brief QuickTime event plays that introduces you to the basic controls and mechanics of combat, and this is actually well done. It's brief and clearly explains the controls. In fact, the whole tutorial area is done excellently in my opinion. The music is just right, the voice acting and the whole atmosphere of the place visually too make it one of the best tutorial sequences I've played in any MMO. It's like playing a movie. I mention it specifically because it makes it a tall ask for the rest of the game to live up to the opening sequences. After the tutorial, you're transported to the main continent of Aeternum and your adventure really begins. When you land in Aeternum, you start in one of 4 starting zones. It's randomized, which means there's no guarantee if you're playing with friends that you'll be able to play together right away. As you progress through the main storyline, you're introduced to the crafting system and sent on a series of quests, most of which involve killing this or that, or killing this or that and collecting this, and sometimes you might just get to collect this. The questing is uninspired. The only difference between the kill and collect quests of this game versus others is that this one often requires you to travel long distances to your destination. There are no mounts, and fast travel points are relatively few and far between. In the beginning, this was actually enjoyable. Being forced to explore the world was exciting because it took me to new areas, many of which were memorable with identifiable landmarks. It was reminiscent of the sense of wonder I had when I was a younger, less jaded MMO player. The world felt alive and interesting. I was always excited to come across a new resource to gather that I hadn't seen before. But this sense of joy quickly dissolved for me, and the traveling very soon became tedious by the 10th quest of basically the same thing. Even the side quests, settlement, faction, and PvP quests became laborious to do because they were so similar to one another. The game became a walking simulator. The sense of exploration lost its luster after I'd seen the same thing about 50 times by that stage. This wasn't helped by a couple of bizarre design choices, including on one quest, which sent me through a level 20 area as a meager level 10 in order to reach my destination. The enemies would hit me for more than half my HP, and at one point I died and was sent back to the closest camp to me, which was on the opposite side of a mountain range that I couldn't climb. So I had to walk back around more than double the distance just to get back to where I died. None of this is helped by the enemies you stumble upon during your adventures either. The promise of action combat in this game had me thinking that I'd be in for somewhat of a Dark Souls-esque experience in each fight, where blocking, dodging, and hitting my enemy would feel impactful and meaningful. After all, the game's director's been quoted as saying that the game was inspired by Dark Souls. It didn't live up to this expectation at all. The mobs in the world had simple, boring attack patterns with no sense of reward for a specific action you took in combat, blocking, dodging, or attacking. As I leveled up my character, the attack patterns varied slightly per mob type, but never became more complex or challenging. In fact, I would say that since playing this game a year ago, combat has actually taken a step backwards. Light and heavy attacks no longer stagger your enemies like they did a year ago. Hits now feel weightless and unimpactful. Damage numbers will pop up, but I no longer get the dopamine rush of knowing that my attacks have actually damaged my enemy. I quickly found out that the best way to deal with enemies, and even large groups of them, was to attack them from range and roll away if they ever got close to me. In short, the combat has lost the sense of reward that it showed promise of a year ago. So much so that I'd honestly enjoy watching paint dry more. Unfortunately, I came to dread questing in this game so much because neither the quests nor the combat could hold my attention. I didn't even make it to doing my first dungeon, or any of the world events, which I'm told are more interesting than the open world PvE experience. However, I would guess that for many players like me, that would be too little too late to keep them interested in the game. When I first played New World, I loved the PvP combat. It was rough around the edges, but I saw the diamond in the rough and the vast potential it had to become my favorite PvP MMO. I enjoyed it so much that I would stand outside of town and wait for someone to come and duel me for no other purpose than enjoyment and improvement. PvP in this game consists of dueling via invitation and open world PvP, which relies on an opt-in system when a player leaves a settlement. Flagging for PvP can be done purely for a small XP boost, or as a requirement in order to complete PvP missions which grant XP, gold, and faction reputation. In theory, this means that there's incentive for players to flag while exploring the world, as you're rewarded for risking your life. But in practice, the PvP system in this game doesn't work. Since the last closed beta test, players have been reporting on various forums that the level scaling that was active in open world PvP has been severely nerfed, giving players who are a higher level a much larger advantage over lower level players. In my opinion, this is very counterintuitive for a skill-based PvP action game. During my time playing the latest open beta, the number of low-level players flagging for PvP quickly dropped after the first day because, like me, they realized that the inconvenience of being killed by a gang of 5 level 20s and then having to run 1 to 2 kilometers back to where you were is not worth the time you save with the 10% experience bonus. Even in a 1v1, as soon as you see a player flagged who is 5 levels above you, you really have no choice but to run or spend the next 5 minutes dodging their attacks and hitting them with the equivalent of a wet noodle. This is problematic because it forces players to rush to max level if they want to PvP effectively. But this is not the change that killed PvP for me. One of the very first videos I made on this channel was addressing the problems with PvP combat in New World a year ago. And while the video and audio are of questionable quality, I think the core points about the feel of combat still stand. There were definitely issues with the balance of PvP at the time, including the hatchet being an overwhelming noob crusher weapon, and in that video I made some suggestions about how PvP combat could be improved. I'm very disappointed to see that rather than take the route of increasing the reward for defensive maneuvers in PvP, the developers decided instead to simplify combat by removing stagger on light and heavy attacks. Now, only weapon skills are able to crowd control or stagger opponents, meaning that the combat when these skills are on cooldown feels like a dodge spamming, attack spamming affair. Previously, it had felt like a game of cat and mouse, where one opportunity attack could lead into a deadly flurry of well-timed combo moves. Now, it feels superficial and, frankly, unrewarding. The skill floor of PvP has been lowered, and I believe the skill ceiling has too. And you might think that's not a bad thing. But the gap between the floor and the ceiling is a lot smaller now than it was before, making PvP much less about skill and more about stats. I actually quite like the skill system in this game. The classic class system is replaced by abilities tied to weapons, much like Elder Scrolls Online. Weapons and abilities are independent of armor class as well, meaning that it's possible to have a healer or mage type in heavy armor, which quite frankly is a wet dream for me. Weapons are leveled up by simply using them in combat or having them equipped. As each weapon levels up, it unlocks active skills as well as passive bonuses, which you can assign skill points into. Each weapon has 2 trees that can be invested into, which serve different purposes from one another. It's a simple but effective system that lets you make the character you want with different combinations of weapons and armor. Armor is classed as light, medium, or heavy, and these weight classes determine what benefits your character receives, as well as their dodge animation. As you might guess, heavy armor lends itself better to tanking, whereas light armor is better for mobility, with medium armor in between. Gear comes in multiple rarities and can be customized with slots and various stats and passives. I really enjoy games that allow armor to be unique to their owner, rather than everyone following the same linear progression path. I can't think of something that's more boring than that, really. The best way to describe the crafting and gathering in this game is that it's like playing third-person over-the-shoulder RuneScape, and I think that's a good thing. It never felt like a chore to gather or craft, and I ended up finding it more interesting than the actual combat in the game. Though, I have to admit that I would not play this game purely for the crafting. The refining and crafting processes were easy enough to understand as well, and the menus were also easy to navigate, and they were pretty plainly laid out. Here the game gets a big tick from me. I found the UI hit and miss. The UI was sleek and modern, it was responsive, and otherwise quite easy to navigate for the most part. But I think this is marred by some of the big misses, and they were significant ones at that, because they related to the map and journal system. The journal layout was time consuming and difficult to navigate because the quest title and its description were lumped together in a lengthy menu that you needed to scroll down, rather than the conventional 2-panel quest log with the title on one side and the description on the other. The map was also a weaker part of the UI. For some reason, it was laggy to pan over the map once it was already opened, a problem which I've never encountered quite like this before, and the zoom function was strangely, extremely sensitive to the point that it was uncomfortable to use. But my biggest gripe was the lack of minimap. I can understand it being a creative choice to exclude the minimap for the purposes of immersion, but having to pull up the profoundly laggy full screen map to navigate through mountains and hills every couple of minutes ends up being a frustrating exercise in patience, even with the compass UI at the top of the screen. Visually, this game gets a tick from me for its world design and aesthetic. While it doesn't do anything drastic or innovative in terms of its presentation, it feels alive, well crafted, and expansive in the open world. Assets are reused in various locations, but this is forgivable in my opinion, as there are equally some memorable locations that appear well thought out and purposeful. Combat animations though, they leave a bit to be desired. For example, the visual effects of the magical weapons look cheap and unconvincing, and the roll animations, they look unnatural and disjointed. Melee weapons on the other hand, are much better handled, despite how they feel when you're actually playing the game. These parts of the game definitely make it feel like they're still in beta. New World's audio design never quite lived up to the opening sequence of the tutorial that I mentioned earlier. It has odd audio balance choices by default, where ambient noise and background music are often drowned out by sound effects of fighting and footsteps. So much so that at several points I had to check my settings to make sure I hadn't turned off the background music by mistake. The music, when I could hear it, was atmospheric and enjoyable. It wasn't as amazing as the music from, say, Final Fantasy XIV, but it does the job well, and here gets the tick of approval from me again. I honestly feel like I could make an entire video on the number of bugs I've found while playing the game, including being stuck inside an iron vein that another player had to mine me out of, or issues with talking to NPCs, or enemy AI bugging out mid-fight. But the video is already far longer than I'd planned it to be, so I'll summarize my feelings on it like this. If I knew nothing about this game and you had shown it to me, I would have thought this game was made by a small indie developer, not a multi-billion-dollar company. I've said a lot of things in this video, but I want to leave you with my final thoughts on New World. If you're looking for an MMO to play and have no other games on your radar at this point in time, then you could consider playing this game. However, if that's not you, then I can't recommend this game is worth your hard-earned money. The current state of the game, less than a month from launch, in combination with its trajectory from 1 year ago, leave me concerned about its future. You might say, well, it just needs time and it'll get there. And I agree, it does need time. Maybe another year or two, until it maybe resembles a complete MMO. Because in its current iteration, it feels underdone, half-baked, and compared with the last time I played, ruined. The game had so much potential, but it's just that, and only that, potential, without the execution that it needs. That's all I've got to say. If you stuck it out and are wanting more, don't forget to hit subscribe. Thanks for watching. Take care and take it easy.